Now they can hear me? Oh, okay. Okay, now I'm louder. Okay, I can sit. I feel like I should stand. Okay. Thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate your presence here tonight. My name is Maya McAmer. I'm the director of the Boulder Watershed Collective, and we are a nonprofit who works locally to increase community and watershed resilience. So community wildfire protection planning is really a combination of both. And that's why we're really excited to work with our partners here tonight and across the entire county to increase our community's resilience to wildfire and really think broadly about the ways we can address all of the issues that we're facing. And so I'm really excited to have all of you here tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to Kieran, our Fire Adapted Communities Coordinator.
Thanks, Maya. As Maya mentioned, I'm Kieran Riddell. I'm the Fire Adapted Communities Coordinator for the Boulder Watershed Collective. And first of all, thank you all for being here. I hope you all got some food because there's plenty. I think I'd like to start by we have a lot of folks here who are participating on the core team for this Community Wildfire Protection Plan update. And I think if we could maybe start with just some intros from those folks and just give us your name and your organization, and if you're playing any special role or specific role on the CWPP update, maybe you could mention that. So maybe you start with Kenzie.
Hi, my name is Kenzie Hart. I am a wildfire analyst. I'm a wildfire analyst with the. Thank you. All good? Wonderful. My name is Kenzie Hart. I'm a wildfire analyst with the Ember Alliance, and we are a contractor who is helping facilitate the CWPP process. The Ember Alliance is a nonprofit based here in Colorado. We're up in Fort Collins, and our mission and our vision, our mission is to restore and repair the relationship between communities and wildfire on the landscape. So we're here facilitating and helping guide your community through this process.
Hello, I'm Erin Freed with the Boulder Watershed Collective, and I'm the Community Engagement Project Manager. And Kieran and I are going to be doing a lot of the community engagement opportunities for the CWPP. And we're trying some newer stuff based on some of our social science research backgrounds, but also a lot of our community engagement projects that we've hosted and done in the past. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Erin. Can I do this?
I got a big voice. I'm Meg Helford with Boulder County. I'm the Wildfire Team Forest and Grasslands Project Coordinator. I'm on this executive core team, and what we'll speak about tonight is the county is also updating their CWPP and how we're integrating with this localized CWPP. So looking forward to meeting all of you.
Hi guys, my name is Kelsey Lesniak. I know some of the faces in the room. I'm a forester with the Colorado State Forest Service. So I'm kind of here representing the State Forest Service and making sure that the Timeberline CWPP meets all of our minimum requirements that are required for the plan and all that stuff. So I'm kind of here just representing the state. So if there's any questions, I can certainly answer them for you guys.
All right, I'm Andrew Jocelyn. I'm the fire marshal here for Nederland Fire. I've been kind of engaged with all the meetings that we've had. There's been lots. I like to think that, the CWPP has a really great plan and model that they can take from place to place. And I'm just kind of here to make sure that we're taking into account the different factors that we have here locally. Yeah, that's about it. Thanks for having us.
Hi, I'm Charlie Schmidtman. I'm the interim chief for Nederland Fire, basically working with Andrew and the rest of the crew just to kind of ensure the correct data is getting pushed forward and the needs for our community being met.
I'm Paul Onder. I'm the fire chief for Timeberline Fire. So just giving input for the Timeberline portion of this. And we'll also be working on the Gilpin County CWPP here shortly. That's out for bid. So hopefully you want to make sure that those two work together as well.
Recently hired as the mitigation coordinator with Timeberline Fire. I'm also involved in the CWPP in Coal Creek as well, and firefighter over there.
Miranda Fisher, town administrator for the town of Nederland. So obviously looking at this from the Nederland component, and then have a couple team members with us over at this table.
Troy Hendrickson, the emergency manager for Nederland.
Brett to meet the community planner for the town.
Did we miss anybody? Okay. Thank you all for being here. I guess, Miranda, if you could just go back one slide real quick. This is an agenda. You all have this on the table already if you're here in person, but if you're here online, this is kind of what you're going to be seeing this evening. First, we'll have a presentation from Kenzie with the Ember Alliance going over kind of what a CWPP is, what people can expect out of this process. And then Aaron and I will give a short presentation, and we'll follow that with about 10 minutes of questions if you all have questions. Then Aaron and I will talk about the kind of engagement process and ways that you can get involved through this process. Another opportunity for questions. And then Meg will talk a little bit about how this is all going to fit into or align with county CWPP planning, which is happening at the moment as well. Followed by more opportunity for questions. Hopefully everybody picked up one of those little question comment cards. We wanted to be respectful of folks' time, but also make sure that we capture anybody's questions. So if we get to a point where people have questions that aren't answered and it's time to move on to the next part of the next presentation, we'd love it if you could write those down and give us those at the end, ideally with your name and email, but if you want to remain anonymous, that's okay. We will be providing some follow-up material where we can make sure your questions get answered that way. So appreciate that. Okay, I think that, Miranda, maybe next slide, and then we'll pass it off to Kenzie. So the objectives tonight are really to give information to community members about the sort of timing, the content, and the purpose of this Community Wildfire Protection Plan update, as well as sharing information about ways that you all can be involved in the process. And then we also want to hear from you a little bit about your interest in being involved in the process, and we'll explain kind of how that will work going forward. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it off to you, Kenzie. Thanks.
All right. Well, hi, welcome. Thank you for having us. I know that a lot of folks here are probably very aware of wildfires and some of the ecological consequences of where we are today, but I want to make sure everyone is starting off on the same place. So we're going to go back to a little bit of background, and then we'll get into a little more information on the CWPP. So why do we need to plan to mitigate wildfire risk? Why can't we just go out and do it? Next slide. So if you look up on the screen there, we've got what we call a fire suppressed forest and an ecologically managed forest. When we say ecologically managed, this is closer to what we know of as historical conditions for the forests that we live in. Up here, we've got many different forest types, but based on lots of history, both looking at scientific models and looking at the trees that have been here and sort of looking at fire regimes that they've had, as well as information from settlers and Native Americans who lived here before us, we know that the trees and the forests that we have out here are not what they used to look like. So what we're doing is we are managing to return them to that historical state. Fire suppressed forest is what we have now. We have stopped having fires here because they burn our structures, and that's kind of freaky. We don't like that very much. So we said, okay, all fires are going to be bad. We're going to put them all out. We don't want any of them. What happened is all these fuels that have all these things that used to burn, they have accumulated, and now we've got a lot of dense fuels, a lot of dense trees and forests. They're not as healthy as they used to be. Maybe they are more susceptible to bugs and pine beetles and diseases, things like that. So what happens is when a fire comes through, there's more fuel. Those forests burn much hotter and potentially burn the earth deeper and are really hard for firefighters to manage. And as you see at the top, those often result in what we jokingly call moonscapes. You'll see this in the East Troublesome fire scar, where it burned really hot and it's hard for things to grow back. There's not much left. In an ecologically managed forest, what we'd have is a much lower severity fire. So this is less intense fire, less fast moving. So it's easier for folks to go in and maybe protect a specific structure around it. And it doesn't burn the ground quite so much. So it's easier for plants and things to grow back. And this is what fires used to look like in certain areas on the landscape here in Colorado. So that's what we're trying to go for.
Yeah, that'd be great. We will have about 10 minutes after Kenzie talks.
Awesome.
Oh yeah, the question was, whether or not to wait with questions. And yeah, if you could wait with your questions until Kenzie's done presenting, we'll have questions right after that.
Thank you. All right, next slide. So these are two photos of here in the valley in Nederland. The one on the left is from the late 1800s. We don't actually have a date on it, but it's somewhere between the 1870s or the very early 1900s. And as you can see, I know it's a little bit grainy, but the hills off in the distance, they're much lighter colored. The trees are more spaced apart, and that's true for both that hill there, and I think folks online can probably see a little better, but even the hills in the back, they have much thinner forests. Over here on the one in 2011, this is thanks to Google, you can see that those forest stands in the same areas are one color. They're dense. The trees are just the same across the entire area. So we know that the forests are not the same way they were before we started changing that fire regime. Next slide. So what you see up here in that little black line, that is the Nederland and Timeberline portion fire protection districts that we are working on in this process. So we are working in all of Nederland Fire Protection District and the Boulder County portion of Timeberline Fire Protection District. They work together really well up here in Boulder County, so we're lumping them together in this one planning process. The area in the Gilpin County portion will have its own CWPP. Those fires that you see are the fires in the last maybe 20, 30 years around here. You can see East Troublesome up in the corner. If we were to have a fire of that scale around here, it would very easily overwhelm the capacity and resources that we have in this area and cause a lot of destruction. That's a significant concern. These fires are becoming bigger. Sometimes they are more severe and they can be very fast moving. So what we want is to ensure that we have the resources to defend this community from said fires and maybe reduce the chance of having ones so big, so fast, so severe. Next slide. The concept of a CWPP is founded on the idea of a fire-adapted community. So these landscapes that we live on, they thrive with fire. They have fire that comes in, it changes it moves the forest, it helps build, it helps create habitat for plants and animals and things like that. So what we want is to have not only the ecosystem that's adapted to fire, but we also want the community that lives here to be just as adapted to wildfire. We want you all who live here to be comfortable with the idea that fire is not going away, but we don't need to be as scared of it as we have been. Planning is one of these wheels, one of these sections, one of these ways that we can go in and maybe help make us a little more fire adapted. Next slide. So a CWPP, as we've been saying, a Community Wildfire Protection Plan, is a process. This process is what a community goes through to identify where they need to work to do mitigation and action first. What is the most important right now? Everyone has limited resources. Where do we spend those dollars? Where do we spend that time to make the most difference? So at the end of this process, we'll have priority project areas. So where on the landscape are we going to work that's going to make the most impact? We will have priority actions for homeowners. So what can you do as a person who lives here, as someone who maybe manages land here, to reduce your risk and the risk to your neighbors? And then what we also need is increased collaboration. And the goal through this process is to have connection points like we're doing right now, where we can talk to you and you can talk to us. And not only are the community connected, but the partners and the stakeholders here are also more connected and more able to complete these landscape scale projects that cross boundaries. Next slide. So this is a quote from the State Forest Service on CWPPs. Community wildfire protection plans represent the best opportunity we have to address the challenges of the wildland-urban interface in a way that brings about comprehensive and locally supported solutions. Next slide. So the CWPP process looks like this. We're starting with community and partner engagement. We are going to hear from the community. We are going to hear from partners and professional stakeholders about what you think the wildfire risk is like, what your concerns are, what your needs are, and what barriers you have to continue action. After that, we're going to do a hazard and risk analysis. So we're going to see where on the landscape there is the most fire risk, what specific hazards are here in the community. After that, we go into a prioritization and implementation planning process. So we take all the information that we've gathered, we get the core team together to look at it, and they say, okay, so these parts are the most important, and here's on the landscape where we can make a difference for that. And then at the end, we do a final document development. So that is both the official document and the outreach materials that the Boulder Watershed Collective will be working on and publishing, the ways that we can communicate what's happened back to you. Next slide. So how do we understand local risk? What are we looking at? Next slide. Our risk assessment has 3 components that go into it. So one of them is local fire behavior modeling and analysis. So as a wildfire analyst, I can take data about the landscape here, about the weather here, and I can predict where we might see the most erratic wildfire behavior, or where is most likely to burn on the landscape, as well as a few other things. We'll do on-the-ground community assessments. So these have actually already happened. We have a wildfire mitigation specialist on staff, and she and I drove around the community for about a week, looked at all of the neighborhoods around here, all of the landscapes, and saw where in these neighborhoods are like specific hazards, where has the most hazards, where has the fewest hazards. So we've analyzed that. And then feedback from the experts. So we've got a big collection, as you've seen, of stakeholders, folks who are on what we call our core team, and they're giving us feedback to make sure that what we're looking at is true. It represents what's actually here on the ground. Next slide. So fire behavior modeling, what you'll see up here is a draft version of some fire behavior maps that we'll see. So some of these darker purple colors that you see are where we're expecting to have more erratic, intense, and severe fire behavior. And where you see the yellow is where we expect to have less intense, maybe slower spreading fire behavior. So we are modeling this based on the newest, best data we have available. Next slide. We take that fire behavior modeling and we go the next step. We go and we look at where does that fire behavior expose homes? So what homes are at risk of being ignited by embers or radiant heat from a wildfire? These are your homes that we're looking at. Next slide. We are also looking at not only residential structures, but we're looking at what other community values there are. So you'll give input to the Boulder Watershed Coalition. They'll talk a little more about this, on where in the community, what you value most in this community and where on the landscape that exists. We're also looking at infrastructure. What is most important for firefighters to have when they're fighting a fire? They need to have communications equipment. They need to have, the water lines and things like that intact. What also needs to be here after a wildfire? What community resources do we need to, in case of a wildfire, rebuild quickly and more effectively? Next slide. We're going to look at the road safety. So we know that evacuation concerns are something that people are thinking more and more about. So where in the community are there roads that are potentially unsafe to evacuate on during a wildfire? We're going to model that, we're going to look at that, and we're going to bring that to the court team. Next. We're also going to model evacuation scenarios. So these will be a few different, maybe fire coming from the west or fire coming from the center of the district. And we have a bunch of people evacuated at the same time. Where on the roads are going to be the most congested? Where is going to have a lot of backup and maybe potentially cause some concern and danger to residents? Next. So what you'll see here are what we are calling plan units. These are the neighborhoods and communities that we're using to assess risk relative in the community. So some of them are out on like 4th of July roads, some of them are in Eldora. I know there's a few others around, but these are the areas you'll be able to zoom in on this map and find your own. But these are the neighborhood plan units that we're using. Next slide. So our on-the-ground assessments, what we've done is we're looking at the relative risk between them. So some areas may have more extreme fire behavior because the vegetation and the topography in that area means that it's more likely for a wildfire to grow large or grow very fast. Some areas may have less of that, but some areas may have homes that are more likely to ignite, whereas others have homes that are less likely to ignite. Some areas may have neighborhood groups that have done a lot of work. Maybe they've done some maybe they have some like local ordinances about who can store, maybe you don't store firewood under there. They all have a community area around where they can or can't do that. So we're looking at some of those very specific risks within these neighborhoods. And then what we're going to do is we're going to identify what specific actions in those neighborhoods you can do. So maybe it is everyone in here has firewood under their deck and we need folks to move that firewood away, move those propane tanks away. Or maybe everyone here has really good defensible space, but the roofs are in bad condition. And so we're going to tell folks maybe it's time to start looking at saving for new roofs in this specific area. Next slide. At the end of this process, what can you expect? What can you as a community member expect to get and see? Next slide. So in the prioritization and implementation process, we're going to take everything we just talked about, all those fire models. We're going to take all the public input that you give to the Boulder Watershed Collective through this process. And we're going to take all the information from the on-the-ground hazard assessments. The core team is going to take all of that, look at it, see what is most important to the community and most important to them as professionals, and they will create these priority projects. Some of them might be a landscape scale treatment, so it might be a few acres over here that is the most important to treat. Some of it might be a specific section of a roadway that's going to have the most impact in the community. And it might be other projects like getting a new engine for the fire district that they need. Next slide. So what you see here is an example from another community of priority projects on their landscape. So areas in that gray color are existing treatments or existing wildfires. And then all of the colored areas are priority projects for them. Each one has a specific goal or objective and specific people who are in charge of that. That's what we'll have at the end of this process. Next slide. We'll also have a priority roadway map. So in here, the areas in that bright red are their top priority roadways to treat. And then areas in the orange and blue are their next top priority roadways. Next slide. And then this is a map of those plan units from another community. So you'll see that some of them are in that red, that most extreme risk category. And then there's high and moderate risk. I wouldn't say that anyone in this community is at low risk of wildfire. So we'll have a map similar to that that shows what plan units maybe need to take the most action and receive the most support from the local fire protection districts and organizations. Excuse me. Next slide. So we're going to look at the home ignition zone and we'll make some recommendations based off that. This is the home itself and the 100 feet within that home that we're asking residents to look at and take action within. Next slide. Home hardening, these recommendations will be based on the home itself. So maybe this is looking at your decking, your roofing, your vents and things like that. We'll have specific recommendations for that. Next slide. You will get a neighborhood-specific risk assessment. So you'll see what we've looked at in your neighborhood, what things we think are the biggest hazards for you, and then what specific next steps we think that residents in your neighborhood need to take. You'll have an interactive online map. And then you'll also have a collection of resources and opportunities for residents. So we'll get this collection of folks here on the core team, plus probably a few others at the end who can help answer questions and share what opportunities and resources that they have available for you. All right, I think we've got a few minutes for questions and comments. I know there was a few here, so we can start with the fellow over there.
Started out with, there's a backlog for us that is. But I sort of take issue with that. This is sort of that a lot of the historical is the historical sort of, it's always going to be a gap. But an accurate reflection and overall saying this is how we want it to look now, like not necessarily error. So I like everything you said. I'm fully. I wish that the focus on the priority shifted a little bit. We're more to the home defense, evacuation routes, what we can do to faster losing that lives. And get away from it to do this CWPP routes start cutting down. And that to mitigate your home, start cutting down. It's not necessarily true. But so I hope I'm making myself clear. I think the priority that it shouldn't be going to have the firefighter or the Forest Service go out there and it's not because or it turns out worse than it was before. Or fire breaks. I think that these are not what we should be spending on money. More education, evacuation, or community. Thanks.
All right. That's great feedback, and I think we'll have some other opportunities for you to share that with the community. Everything that we are doing as an organization is based off of the best available science that we have. So we are constantly going out doing research, getting information from experts in the field, and the goal is maybe not a steady state point in time, but continuing those processes, making sure that those processes that would always happen are able to continue happening, because currently they can't happen. So that's why we're coming in from sort of a multi-prong approach with both the resident action, taking care of your own homes, and also looking at the landscape scale.
CWPP minimum requirements, don't they asset monitoring? See how well is the CPP? They look for total acres treated, amount of water, biogas, tons of biogas collected. So the metrics for seeing if it's performing seem to be about.
Okay, that's not part of the current CSFS CWPP minimum standards. So we're, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, one of the things that
Yeah, can I just say, fill out my own.
hopefully I can. One of the three, and Kelsey can speak on this, is one of the three minimum standards is structure ignitability, that the CWPP needs to address that. And I think that's one of the most important things for us as foresters, as well as the fire protection districts, is how do we get that outreach and education into the community, as well as provide those tools, whether it be money, expertise, again, outreach and education, so that folks are focusing on that structure ignitability, that most important your house on out. So that's one of the main goals.
Yeah, I can just really quick speak to, you also mentioned prioritization, and you'll see that there will be opportunity for community input on prioritization through this process as well. So I just wanted to address that. Yeah, Alex, go for it.
Is this online?
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can actually hear me. That's great. Okay, hi. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't catch, I was having trouble getting my download done to get into the program. Who's speaking? I didn't get the information of who you are.
I think that might be directed to me. Hi, my name is Kenzie Hart. I'm a wildfire analyst with an organization called the Ember Alliance. We're a nonprofit that works to restore the relationship between communities and wildfire on the landscape.
Okay, all right. And I think you were giving the previous presentation, right? So, I think it's, I think it would be useful to look a little bit more deeply at the beginning of your presentation, because you talked about, what's the wording? Fire suppressed forests, right? And this comes up a lot in discussions of local fires, but what I'd like to see is a more nuanced information to the community about the differences between lower montane, ponderosa-based forests, where there's actually quite good evidence that the undergrowth is much thicker than it was, let's say 100 or 150 years ago, when there were more frequent fires in that regime. That's always the example used, and your diagrams show that. But what's always missing in discussion is by the time we get to Nederland, we're no longer in lower montane. We are pushing upper montane and beyond into alpine terrain, where the forests are not currently in a fire suppressed state. They are in their natural state of having infrequent fires. Now, we can certainly agree that there would have been more low frequency severe fires over the last 100 years had humans not been suppressing them, right? To suggest that the forests are the main problem is that the forests are in a fire suppressed state of that elevation is just not supported by the current science. Similarly, the East Troublesome fire, which, I mean, I'm not familiar with the whole fire, but I was backpacking last week through the parts of it in Rocky Mountain Park. And again, the issue is not that the fire was too severe and things can't grow back. Quite the contrary. If you go hiking in some of those areas, you will see the most beautiful, vivid explosions of light in the bird areas that you ever have a chance to experience, right? Because those forests are, as you previously said, ecosystems that are adapted to fire. And yes, they look very different after a fire than before, but things are growing and the ecosystem is working correctly. So my point is that this lack of nuance comes up over and over and over again in community discussions about fire, and essentially giving an excuse to do forest treatments in areas where it's actually not helpful to do so. And I'm saying all forest regions are useful. And certainly I do agree with you with some of the evacuation route and road areas that, you're going to need to deal with, makes a lot of sense. But the current science has moved and is starting to point very, very strongly to the need to protect structures, at and near the structures, not, trying to treat our way out of forests. Right? So, I mean, it's a very broad subject, but I'm just, think this audience needs to be aware that the picture you painted at the beginning of your presentation is actually not aligned with current science.
I would be delighted to have more conversations and talk more to the community about the different ecosystems. The CWPP documents themselves and the accompanying documents will go into depth about the different ecosystems, their different fire regimes, and their different needs. So all the priority projects will also address that. We won't treat them all like lower montane ponderosa pine forests, but for the purposes of an introductory presentation for this, we use one example to help get folks on board with the general concept, and then hopefully later on we can add in that nuance. We absolutely will do that.
My only comment is I'm all for getting folks on board with the general concept. And again, I think you're going in the right direction in general, but I think, starting with essentially an incorrect concept for the Nederland area is not a great way to bring folks along, right? It just because when they discover that the information is not correct later, that's not going to be conducive to getting people on board, right? I think the nuances are necessary in the first presentation, to get people to begin to focus on the importance of, the housing areas. You talked about the need to get people to deal with things like, roofs and sidings and the terrain around them. It's going to be, your biggest push. And probably the most difficult thing to get coordinated cooperation. Because people don't understand what's going on or feel like they've been misled, you're starting off on the red foot. I mean, that's my opinion. We can have a deeper conversation about this. I'd be happy to take it offline.
Yeah, we'll have some opportunities for community engagement and community input and conversation. So I think Boulder Watershed Coalition can meet with you about that too. Let's see, I think I saw your hand up.
Probably walk. Can I? Oh, yeah.
All right. I just wanted to point out that depending on when that picture was taken of the forest, when mining hit this area, all of the trees were cut. And the stumps are there to prove that. So to just say that that was what the forest looked like because of fire, I think can be a little bit misleading. And I also want to echo, what Mark said, that the focus really needs to be on protecting homes and protecting the community and less about how many trees are we going to cut.
Thanks. I think we're hearing a lot of commentary about sort of this idea of where to prioritize, and that's awesome. And there will be opportunities to get into more detail about the prioritization phase of this process.
All right.
Oh, sorry. Did you have a question?
Two questions. One, can we get copies of this? Because we couldn't see the maps or any of that sort of stuff. So, and two, wildfire partners have been partnering with us in that first 150 feet. Are they part of this program?
We do not have any representation from them on the court team currently. Oh, I'm so sorry.
But yes, it could. Mike. Sorry. Yes, wildfire partners will be a part of this, and when we get to that stage for this localized CWPP, we'll give you all the information. And then as far as the Boulder County-wide CWPP, that's a main section in there because wildfire partners is a really important program for this entire county. And we know a lot of folks up here have engaged in it, and we want to get more folks engaged in that. So yeah, and both the wildfire partners, that structure, ignitability, defensible space can go hand in hand with forest management. And I get, and we hear your concerns. We're not meant to go out and go up to the higher montane and clear where we're not. That's why the risk assessment is so important, because that's where they'll prioritize. It's all going to be localized around in here, that high priority.
Thanks, Meg. I think I'm going to take one more question. And then after that, if you don't mind, I think the next question was over here. Was it you? Okay. After that, please feel free to write down your questions. We do want to hear them. And then for folks online, if you can put them in the chat, that would be amazing. And we'll make sure and capture those.
And as they're transitioning right now, just letting you know that this presentation is recorded, and we're also going to pass out the presentation PowerPoint. So you'll get the recording and the PowerPoint. Yeah, just letting you know.
I just have a more fundamental question. I don't know if this group is the right group for it, but we obviously have a 2011 CWPP, and I'm curious, it sounds silly, but fire behavior hasn't changed to my knowledge since 2011. So what's the idea behind redoing it? And then what was done on the last one? How was that document deployed to drive? Because reading it just for my neighborhood, anecdotally, it all looks the same. So I'm curious how it was deployed, one, and then B, if it's not all completed, what's the idea behind completely redoing it?
That is a great question. So community wildfire protection plans are intended to be updated on a regular basis. The goal is to have a living document that we are looking at as we make progress, and then the ideal is 5-year updates. Every 5 years, we don't have to do a full overhaul of the CWPP. We can address what has changed. So if there hasn't been a lot of change in the landscape, we can maybe not do the risk modeling, but we can look at neighborhoods that time. And if there has been a big fire, we can go in and redo the CWPP risk modeling at that time. So the goal is for them to be living documents. What happened in the early aughts and early 2010s was those documents were created, and in most fire protection districts or counties, they weren't used to take action. And so they sat there for a while. So the 2011 CWPP, if I recall, hasn't been an active part of what folks are using to make management decisions. So we want to update that and then include some more modern parts of these. So one of the things we look at that hasn't been looked at is maybe those roadway safety concerns. We look at social vulnerability kind of things. We include those in those modern CWPPs, as well as a lot more community input than maybe happened in the past. I will leave it to maybe the chiefs to talk about how that 2011 CWPP informed any of their actions.
Actually, just trying to write some notes down just to kind of talk a little bit about fire behavior has changed a bit, maybe not. This feels super weird. Can you hold that for me? Thanks. So fire behavior has changed a bit. So we're seeing a lot more, so our 1,000-hour fuel, so our bigger timber, all of that is much drier now. We're seeing fires that are so much hotter that they're just so difficult to fight. So we're seeing just those little things are making a huge impact on the actions that we have when it comes to fighting fire. The other things that we're seeing more dead trees around, so that impacts fire behavior as well. We're seeing a lot more houses being built either closer together or even farther away. That makes it harder for us to get to the fire prior to it creating a large start. So I think some of those things we have to kind of look at, and everybody is talking about, not everybody, a lot of people are talking about just clear cutting or patch cutting or doing these things. One of the ideas behind having those cuts is that it slows the fire growth and it helps us to kind of reset or pick up in an area where we maybe wouldn't have been able to before. So we look at area, the wildfire group will We'll look at big areas of big, heavy, dense trees and what would, kind of get an idea of what would happen if we had to start in that area and what the reaction would be. Let's say if something came from far from the west, would we be able to stop it? Could we even get to it, before it came to our town? So these are kind of some of the things that everybody in this core group is looking at. So I think that's all I got for now.
Thanks. I think one of the other things, and I'll touch on one of the comments from earlier, is when we're doing this fire behavior modeling, we're looking at weather conditions from the last 20 years and augmenting them a little bit to adapt for climate change. So the modeling that was done in 2011 is based on older fire data and maybe using average conditions. We're using slightly more aggressive conditions in our modeling now because we know that that's happening far more frequently. And so we're modeling based on more extreme conditions and seeing how that might affect the community.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having us here. Again, I'm Erin Freed with the Boulder Watershed Collective. And I want to just address that last comment. That was a great question. And one thing that Kieran and the graduate student team that they did last year was they did some research on why CWPPs might have been put on the shelf. And part of that was community engagement, community input. People didn't really know about it. So we're here to give a little bit of perspective on how to integrate that in a way that is really tangibly used in the CWPP process, but then also supports the leadership within these communities and neighborhood areas. So I'm going to go into how we're going to do that. It's a tricky thing. Okay, next one. So we really want to hear from you all and others who live here, as many people as possible, and integrate this input throughout the whole process. And so we have these several goals in mind. The first is to gather geospatial community input. So you probably raise your hand if you've been a part of a survey before around wildfire. Or a survey in general that you get. Yeah, surveys have been done. We know surveys work, but they also, people can get very tired of them. So we're trying to gather information that is going to be geospatial in its nature around community values. That includes landscape values, ecosystem health values, and wildfire risk perceptions. Where do you think potential wildfire could ignite? What kinds of monitoring efforts do you want to see in these areas? So we're going to try and gather that geospatial information with priorities that you all have and the actions you want to see in these places. We're going to try and coordinate wildfire risk reduction with other community values and priorities. That includes understanding where there might be high conflict with your values and potential project priorities that could really reduce wildfire risk. That's a huge thing to understand. Where is it that we're seeing on the landscape where these conflicts may happen? Where are places where agreements could really happen, especially around home ignition zone and defensible space work? We're also trying to support the reciprocal exchange of ideas, to have local knowledge, place-based knowledge. You all experience this day to day. You go hiking, you understand elements of the landscape that, a core team may never be able to, or locals who are working as wildfire professionals, they understand it in a different way as well. So we're trying to integrate all these different perspectives, and hearing community input is one perspective of this full, comprehensive, multi-objective process. We also hope to establish local leadership on the action, and we have a couple ideas for that. We really want to hear your input tonight on how we can establish that local leadership for wildfire action. Like, we know that some areas are going to have high wildfire risk because of the structures, but how do we get your neighborhoods to move? What are some ways we can get contractors to work on houses, multiple houses at a time? Those kinds of efficient action items. And then we also want to include folks who are often left out of the wildfire conversation or who maybe can't attend. We want to reach out to advocates for potentially the unhoused population, for instance, or renters in the area. We really want to hear from you all about who you think might be most at risk and also not often included in these conversations. Next slide. So we know you're all very busy. So we are trying to find different opportunities that hit at these different levels of engagement, from lower opportunities, lower engagement, lower time commitment, to much higher time commitment if you want to be more involved. And so we're going to go through several of these opportunities that we've put together. And again, we'd love your input. And we're going to ask a few questions of you at the end of our presentation as well. So yeah, tonight we're kind of viewing this as like the learner. Public is informed about projects and ideas and kind of the beginning of this process. You can contribute. We have a couple opportunities to contribute your ideas, and we want to gather your feedback about the final document. We have opportunities to participate and give where you like project priority ideas and wildfire risk perceptions. And then we also have an idea for partnering, which is kind of this later phase of the CWPP process, which is hopefully the living phase of it after it's created, to create a wildfire council. And we'll talk about that as well. So next slide. So what are we doing? When are we doing this? Opportunities for engagement. Tonight, you're here. Awesome. Check. Next one. We're hoping through fall 2023 and throughout until the end of this year, maybe even next year, developing individuals who want to represent their areas, and I'll show you the areas we're talking about, to be wildfire representatives. So we know that everyone has these conflict of values. You have things that you're focusing on at different times of the day and different times of your life. And so if you feel like, I want to be someone who people can go to represent wildfire readiness in my area, and I have these cool ideas to get people engaged because I know the people who live here, then this is right up your alley, and we'd love to have you on this. It's not fully formed yet. We're still forming it. We'd love input on kind of what the structure of that might look like. We're also hoping to form a youth council. And that is going to be through structures that already exist. We've met with the Nederland Youth Committee, and their recommendation was to integrate it into one of the high school classes. And so we're still working on that right now, but we're trying to understand how youth could be involved in maybe some aspect of wildfire readiness or monitoring ecosystem health in some ways. So we're still working on that piece. So again, I kind of already talked about this, but it's essentially the Wildfire Council is tapping into these networks that currently exist and finding people who really want to be the point person for their neighborhood to learn about wildfire readiness and some of the projects that are going to come out of the CWPP. Next slide. So where would these units exist? Well, we're kind of planning this with the planning units in mind. So we have the CWPP planning units, and these would be units for action for mitigation priorities, for instance, units for organizing community members within neighborhoods, and then opportunities to identify hyper-local actions. So again, like I said, you all have really good ideas of how to engage those around you, and that is something that it's so powerful to have that local knowledge and be able to act on that in a way that's very specific and could be more successful than kind of higher level, like, oh yeah, you should do more mitigation. That's great. That's a great recommendation, but there's ways that you all could inform the education that could be tailored to your areas. So it's really hard to see this, but when we send the PowerPoint out, you can see some lines. We've decided to do community engagement within the planning units. We're grouping planning units together. And we're hoping that this allows our community engagement areas to give input in kind of both an efficient way, but also in a way that captures more kind of personalized, localized perspectives on wildfire risk perception. But we're hoping to also have at least one or two representatives that could be on that wildfire council within each of these areas. Both within the larger community engagement area, but within each of the planning units would be ideal eventually. Okay, I'm going to hand it off to Kieran.
Okay, so that brings us to this third kind of opportunity for engagement. We're calling it Community Values and Wildfire Action Mapping Input. Another term for this is public participatory GIS. So essentially what we're hoping to do here, and Miranda, you could go to the next slide actually, is to hold focus groups within those engagement units that Erin mentioned. So kind of grouped together a few planning units at a time. And sit down with people with physical maps. And this would be an opportunity for people to put lines, points, polygons on a physical map. And then what we can do with that is take that physical map and turn it into a GIS data layer. And we can overlay that with core team planning layers that are being developed also in order to kind of get a sense for where there's overlap and where there is less overlap. And so we can use that information to inform, again, that kind of prioritization phase of the CWPP process. So that's the idea with that mapping piece of the engagement opportunities. We can go to the next slide. So then this next piece is referring to last year I was part of a graduate student team that, and let's do next slide, that conducted some we did 3 community workshops and we did 36 interviews and tried to get kind of a diversity of perspectives through those processes and collected a lot of data already. So we have a lot of really robust data on the perspectives that people shared in that kind of initial engagement process. And so this touch point is really referencing the fact that we intend to incorporate that data into the CWPP process throughout this coming year. So that's going to be a priority. Next slide. And then, so in February of 2024, the idea is to have a draft CWPP completed. And this opportunity is for people to provide input on that draft CWPP before it gets finalized. Next slide. And hopefully what we're envisioning for this is that it'll be an online platform for people to submit public comments on the CWPP draft. There's a possibility we could do this as a workshop. We don't want to wear people out with workshops. So we'll just kind of try and keep getting a sense for what will work best for the community here on that. And then next slide. And then the final piece is the community share back. So we want to have a platform where we can make sure that we're sharing back everything that we're learning from you all as this process continues. You'll see there's a QR code there, and that, if you go there, would take you to a story map that summarizes the 2022 research and engagement that we've already completed. And the idea here is that we would, you can go to the next slide too, Miranda, is that we would update that story map to share back what we've learned, as I mentioned, and start to include some next steps for community members as we move into the implementation phase of the CWPP so that people can understand kind of what their role is there. And ideally have there also kind of a digestible short version of the CWPP that's a little bit more accessible to people than the over 100-page document that the CWPP often ends up being. So right now, if you go to that QR code, it's just a summary of what we've done so far in terms of engagement, but we'd like to continue to keep that as a living document and continue to share back everything that we're hearing from people to make sure that we're capturing what you want to share with us. Next slide. So we have some questions for you, and we have another QR code. I'm sorry, but this is a second QR code. The link to that one is also on the story map, but this is a handful of questions that we would love for you to answer for us about your interest in engaging in these opportunities as the CWPP process continues. So we'd really, even if it's just sign me up on the email list, I want to just be kept abreast of what's happening. That's totally fine. We'd love to get that from you. And then we have a couple of other questions. As we move forward with particularly that, that values and concerns priorities mapping that we talked about, we'd love to know who needs to be represented at those workshops or focus groups that we might not be capturing. We'd also love to hear from you, how can we contact people and how can we get in touch with people on that kind of more localized manner to make sure that people who want to be involved can be involved. And then the last piece there is, what are your questions for us? So I think that concludes our presentation. We'll take questions for a few minutes. I'll go here since we haven't heard from you yet. Okay, awesome. Oh my God, I'm sorry.
I'm gonna ask you to hold that for just a second. Yeah,
What do you want me to hold?
the microphone.
Okay.
All right. My name is CT Hutt. I'm a volunteer on the Parks Board. We recently renamed a piece of open space between the Mud Lake area, which is out of town, and the Sunnyside neighborhood. And as we were going around doing a survey, a lot of people volunteered to come help take slash and down trees out of that lot. Having a barbecue in a couple weeks, and it would be great if there were some resources I could point people at to say, hey, if you want to chip in, if you want to volunteer some here, here's how you do it. If you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. We can definitely share some information that you can share at that event. I guess a place to start would be our story map, where we're kind of trying to kind of keep everything updated, and the survey, which is the second QR code, which is also on that story map. So that would be an awesome place to start, but we'd love to chat with you more about that.
Should we take one online and then one, and then we'll get you next? Sound good? Yes, Alex, yes, go for it.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to go to something we talked about a bit earlier, it came up in the discussion earlier, and this was about the fire weather severity work that you folks mentioned, right? Now you showed one of you showed earlier in the presentation a very interesting map that showed crown firing behavior potential in, I don't remember if it was moderate and then extreme fire weather, right? Now, the very interesting thing about that, and I think it's an important piece into, again, in your outreach to the community, to understand that essentially in 98% of the fire weather, our Timeberline Fire District and the other resources they can tap into more broadly, do a very good job of dealing with fires that endanger buildings, right? I mean, occasionally they lose a building here and there, but they can handle it, right? It's in the 1%, 2%, depending whose opinion I ask. I've heard 2%. 1% worst fire weather situations is when the large fires happen, as we observed over the last few years, right? So in terms of modeling, I see this in my interactions with the U.S. Forest Service, right? They model 90th percent fire behavior. Well, not very interesting. We don't need to do very much to deal with 90th percent fire behavior. Now, again, I'm not advocating complacency. The reality is our fire resources can handle 90th percent. It's 99th percent that burns towns, right? Destroys places, right? So again, it's I would suggest in your outreach and thinking, start getting the information out to people. I mentioned earlier, these are forests that are reasonably healthy and are in reasonably normal conditions at the altitudes of Netherlands, but they will burn extreme at some point, sooner or later, right? And people really start to need to wrap their heads around that, right? And your fire modeling needs to wrap its head around that. Now, again, not heading to the conclusion that then, okay, let's cut down the forest because it might burn. We want to have a forest. The forest will burn. It will crown. It will burn. We want to keep it here. The question is, how do we live through all that? Now, you've got a lot of dimensions of your fire plan that address the question of how do we live through that, right? And I think that's an encouraging effort. But again, I think a little bit more precision in your initial outreach with people may get them a little bit more, get their heads around it. The other thing I'd suggest is the film Elemental, which you probably are familiar with. If you're not, you should go see it, but you should using that also as an outreach effort. The more people in the community who see that film, the better, because it begins to explain some of these nuances that are critical for which houses, survive and which don't. What's really the danger from crown fire? Anyways, I'll stop at that point.
Thanks, Alex. So I think you were maybe referencing some slides from Kenzie's presentation, but in terms of community engagement and outreach, you mentioned a few things, and we'd love for anyone to come on that wildfire council and help figure out ideas on what kinds of things you want people to be educated on. I mean, in conjunction with what we hear and see in the CWPP process, but we'd love to hear from you all on kind of what kinds of education you think people want to hear and how would we do that. So we're here to kind of support your ideas, and those are great ideas. So thanks. Yes.
So you had a question about the modeling, and I just wanted to comment on that. This is Andrew with Nederland Fire. Sorry. With the weather modeling that we looked at, we adjusted it so that we were looking at the 70th percentile as well. So we're looking at something low for hot, dry, windy, but we're also looking at 95th for our high end. So I feel like we're taking into account different types of weather patterns and things that we see, and different types of fire starts, whether that's from lightning strikes or man-made, something started on the ground. So I appreciate your input on that. I'd like to talk to you more about the modeling at some point in time.
Yeah, well, you're welcome to reach out. But again, my point is 95 is not relevant. 99 is, right? And that's not just my opinion. I've been talking to experts about this, right? So again, it's very reassuring you're doing 50th and 95th, but the relevant conditions in which we're going to have a catastrophe is 99th, right? And beyond, right? Because with climate change, we're going to go beyond, beyond that, right? So,
Sure.
Yeah,
And if
happy
you
to
look
talk
out the
to you. I
window
don't know how
right
to
now,
get-
we're in the 50th percentile, but fire starts happen in this weather as well. But actually, I
No,
just
I
heard an
look-
update that we're getting data from the 97th. So we're getting
97th,
closer.
getting closer.
to what
Getting
you want.
closer.
Yeah.
Of course, fire starts happen. The point is, when do the catastrophes happen, right? That's the distinction, right?
Okay.
Yeah. But anyways, if you want to, I don't know, how do I can put in my chat my contact information.
Yeah, please do.
If anybody want, I'm gonna just do that to everybody right now. And
you.
if anybody wants to contact me, I'm happy to get into much more in-depth discussions, and I'm happy to get pushback from you folks as well, right? But there's a lot here, right? Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, my name's Wes Eisenhart. This process that the Boulder Watershed is doing, my question is, who is paying for the CWPP? And the more critical question is, how are you going to fund the results of the CWPP? I think I was involved in participation of the original CWPP in Gilpin County. And one of the things that came out of it is we had designated emergency egress routes across private property, and yet there was no money to pay royalties to the people or to create gates for them. So the question is, when you come up with these recommendations in the CWPP, how are you going to put together the funding for it so you can actually do something?
Take that one. Okay, so first question, who's funding the CWPP? So we were able to get a grant for $28,000 from the Action for Implementation and Mitigation. That's through an organization called Coalitions and Collaboratives. And then Nederland Fire, Timeberline Fire, Town of Nederland, and also United Power have contributed cash funding to cover the cost of the consultant and the development of the CWPP. And then all the time from the Boulder Watershed Collective is coming from other grants that we have through the Colorado Water Conservation Board. So it's a real mishmash of stuff that we've been able to pull together for that. And then to your second question, how are we going to fund it? I think this goes back to your question, which was, why did these plans, these previous plans that we have, sit on the shelf for a decade? And that was largely because there wasn't funding to fund those projects, or there was very little funding. And we are lucky now that there is actually quite a lot of money from the federal government, the state government, and also Boulder County has a new wildfire mitigation tax. And so between all of those sources, there's much more opportunity to actually fund the projects that are recommended in the CWPP. And some of that funding actually requires an updated CWPP. So that means one that is within 10 years. And so that's why we have to do this one right now so that we can be eligible for some of those federal funds that are available. Other questions?
I think Maya, unfortunately, I think we might have to ask folks to take the rest of the questions for this portion to your little comment cards. I'm glad that you all have so many questions and we really want to hear from you about those. So make sure to share them. But we want to hear from Meg. As well on how this fits in with county CWPP planning. So thanks, Meg.
What your questions are going to be. If we have a local CWPP, why do we need a countywide CWPP? And quite honestly, they're much the same, but they're also very different. Where your local Nederland one, they're really getting down to the neighborhood risks and needs and challenges. Where the countywide one, we're doing the same thing, but it blankets the entire county. So you could, yeah, sorry. And I know that is real faint, but up there, that first circle is a countywide CWPP. We call that the 10,000 foot view. And then you get down to your next, I can't even see that one, but more of like a community-wide or a local agency. That's your 5,000 foot view. And where you guys are at is your local fire protection district, your local community. That is really getting down to the neighborhood view. And that's what you need in this community. Those risks need to be identified right here up close and personal with your concerns about, where can we prioritize and put our resources to. So what does the county do? It does, and I know folks don't like this, it does act as an umbrella. And what we'll do with the county, same thing. These guys have a fantastic community outreach engagement process going on. And because they started so early, we couldn't get on that bandwagon. But we have been talking a lot. I'm on the executive core teams. I'm leading the county one. Unfortunately, we couldn't match. So we're going to have a community engagement open house event here in October. And there'll be stations and you'll be able to come and put your comments, ask questions about forest management, wildfire, the alert system, response. We'll have all kinds of stations for you to come. That will help inform not only the countywide one, but we can share whatever input to this local one, right? And we tried really hard to coordinate it so we wouldn't survey you to death or community engagement you to death. It didn't happen. So put on your calendar. It's a Saturday, and we'll probably have it right here in this room, and it'll be for a couple of hours. It'll be very interactive, where you can go to each station and ask really organic and specific questions about forest management and what we're thinking and structure ignitability and what kind of programs that the county can offer. And I know that's a big question. So that's really what we're going to do. We'll link all of the local fire protection district CWPPs into our countywide one. And we will have a very robust project prioritization, identification and prioritization section. That doesn't necessarily have to mean forest thinning throughout, but there will be projects like that identified in there. But we'll also have community level outreach and education needs and what we need. And like Maya said, most of the grants, the state, the local, the federal grants require projects, whether it's planning, outreach and education, or forest management, fuels reduction, requires them to be identified in a CWPP. And like Maya said, back in the day, we didn't have this kind of funding. And this is the opportunity for us to really help our communities get that funding, right? And along with that, we're also developing from the county a grant program. And that is to help offset, let's say Boulder Watershed applies for a Colorado State Forest Service grant, a furworm grant. Our program will be that match to help offset that burden, that financial burden for all of you, right? So we can do fuels mitigation. We can do community-wide defensible space. And along with that, I wasn't going to go into this, but along with that, our wildfire partner program, we've done over 3,000 assessments here in the Western communities, right? We're expanding that out to the east, but not yet. We really want to keep the momentum here in the mountains, right? We don't want to forget that. So the engagement that these guys are doing with the Nederland CWPP process is real important that we hear from all of you so we can keep wildfire partners going here. Our chipping program is expanding. We just hired a new person to run that, and we're hoping it will be contractor based and it will be funded by county money, where if we can get 5 or more residents who prune, collect slash, that we come and we can do a chipping program localized in a neighborhood and then haul that slash off. Okay, so that's coming on board. Our sort yard, very popular here up in Nederland, and I can't stress how hard that is to manage and keep going, right? But we are looking at ways to continue to support that and expand that. So that's going on. And we're also, along with other programs, we're engaging in a very robust outreach and education program where Boulder Watershed Collective is a partner, fire protection districts are partners. We're really collaborating on that. So we can do these outreach and education programs about forest management, right? About fire weather, about fire behavior, and have some of these conversations that maybe everyone is seeking. So along with all that, that's all that will be identified in the county CWPP. And I'm on, like I said, we have like 5 different CWPPs on. I'm on every executive core team to make sure that we're going to capture that local level and it's not just going to sit on the shelf. I've been working with CWPPs for 18 years and they have been dusty documents in the past, and that I know that all of us are very targeted to keep these active. That's what these story maps will do. Well, we're going to have an active database. So let's say a project's not identified in the CWPP, but something comes up. let's get that in there, right? So it'll be very, we'll keep it update and very relevant so that we can find you all funding. And that's really what it boils down to. And with that funding comes that technical expertise, whether it's the Colorado State Forest Service, the Boulder Watershed Collective, or the fire protection districts helping you with those projects. So I kind of just went aside from the PowerPoint, but if you have any questions, let me know. I didn't really go too much.
Thanks, Meg. Okay, yeah, but really quick, I want to just mention, there is a county-wide survey that we can share the link to that in our follow-up materials. And we are close to time, but I'm happy to stick around and take a couple more questions. Before people leave though, in case people do have to go, just want to remind you all to share your questions if we don't get to them verbally on those comment cards. If you didn't sign in when you came in, we'd love to get your contact info so that we can continue to kind of get your input or reach out to you with more information. There will be a recording of this meeting, as Erin mentioned. We'll share the slides from the presentations, and we'll also share some follow-up materials, including addressing those questions that we don't get to today. So with that, we can take a few more questions.
Alex mentioned that fire has to be executive root cause elemental, be national wildfire. And it's just like you recommend everybody. See it's documented.
Yeah. Yeah, and as county folks, we were actually tasked to go see it, right? And there's some good things in there, and there's maybe some things that needs a little bit more explaining, right? And so that's where some of these open house events will really help kind of get into those deeper discussions about forest management, fire behavior, fire weather, right? Because it has changed and fires have gotten bigger and they have become more destructive. And our weather has changed, right? And back in the day when I fought fires, you know, a 5,000 acre fire was huge. And now we're talking over 100,000 acres where they're not controllable and they are destroying homes and infrastructure. So that's the importance of trying to plan and help residents, and if anything, become situationally aware and become ownership of where you live. So.
Involvement with
The Colorado State Forest Service or the U.S. Forest Service? Yes, they're on the executive core team and they're on, yeah. And they're on our executive core team and they're on Ned's executive core team. They're on most of all core teams who, when they're, we like to get them at the table. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's, I think that's a good idea. And I think what we'll do is for sure in our open house, when we hold that in October, is have them here. It seems like that would be a good fit for all you. Anything else?
Yeah, so it is 7. Technically, we're supposed to be wrapping up now. Like I said, I don't mind taking a handful more questions, but also want to respect y'all's time. If people need to go, that's totally fine too. But are there any other questions?
I didn't go through my whole thing. I just talk off my head. You're pretty. Yeah.
And we'll be sticking around too, so feel free to come up and ask individual questions as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. We really appreciate it.
I don't know.
So can I ask one more question if you're still there? Oh, guess not.
Alex, I see that you have a
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, I do. I just, because
Miranda's gonna drop my email in the chat for you and you can send your question to me if you'd like to.
yeah, I just wanted to understand who's who here because it's a little hard to tell from the remote side. I understand Boulder Watershed Collective, that's where you're from, right? Karen, is that who I'm talking to?